Our first lecturer is Professor Peter Hemmersam. He's professor in urban design at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, also known as AHO. The acronym Peter is also directs the Oslo Center for Urban and Landscape Studies, and he co-directs the Executive Master in Urbanism. Generally, his research includes topics such as Arctic urbanism, urban design practices, strategic design for placemaking, and sustainable urbanism. He is also author of several books related to urban planning, environment, and placemaking, and he will hold us the lecture titled Oslo, Balancing Sustainability and Urban Challenges. Peter, are you ready? The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to meet you all remotely and be able to tell you something about the situation in the context where I live and operate, which is in Norway, in Oslo. So what I will do today is I will talk briefly about three different things. I will say something about urban sustainability policies and the way they play out and have played out in Norway and in Oslo. I will say something about a few projects that I think might be interesting to hear more about in this context. I'll say something about what it means that Oslo is a winter city. And then I will end the presentation with talking a bit about the kind of social sustainability challenges we sort of encounter in the green shift and sustainability planning in Oslo. So for context, Oslo was a European green capital in 2019. This is a thing that the European Commission sort of announces, and there are several reasons why Oslo was kind of nominated and sort of awarded this designation 5 years ago. One of it was that the city had one of the most ambitious climate strategies, and it was very much in line with the Paris Agreement on climate change and climate change policies. The second was that Oslo was the first city in the world with its own climate budget. Oslo and Norway in general is a world leader on electric mobility, with now the vast majority of cars sold being electric. It was the first city to test carbon capture and storage from the big waste incineration plant in the city. It was a pioneer in waste management in different ways also, and it used purchasing power to accelerate the green transition, for instance, by creating a new market for zero-emission construction machinery. There was large public investment in public transport and bike infrastructure. The city had policies preserving nature and biodiversity, and a big program had been rolled out in the years ahead of the award for reopening waterways and rivers in the city. So just to kind of give you a bit of context for what it is Oslo has done over the last couple of decades, kind of summed up in these 7 points. So when I talk about Oslo, I usually start by sharing this remarkable fact that usually surprises people a lot. The city of Oslo is 70% forest. That, of course, relates to the kind of historical situation in Oslo with relatively small population and a large hinterland and a reliance on logging as the main industry for many years. It's also a question of geography. So the city you see on the image on the right is in the lowlands, where the green forest is in the hills, sort of more than 100 meters above sea level to the east and to the north of the city. A few more facts. Oslo has over 700,000 inhabitants at the moment. It's been growing steadily over many years. It's been growing steadily due to people moving from other parts of Norway, but also from external migration, international migration. Oslo has, as I mentioned already, with the European Green Capital, sort of sustainably been consistently be ranked as a kind of sustainable cities in many ways. Here's another example. This is the Arcos Sustainability Index from 2023, so last year. That sort of randomly, you could say, not randomly, but locates Oslo on top of a lot of kind of other much bigger cities, but also cities that are more comparable in size, like Stockholm and Copenhagen, that are sort of just below Oslo. So we're very proud of that. It's of course always a bit random with these indexes because who do you choose to include and who are not excluded? But I don't have to say anything more about that at the moment, I think. So I'll start by saying something about the kind of urban sustainability policies that has been in place and been enacted in Oslo over decades. I'll start by going back to the 1950s. What you see here is the 1950 general plan for Oslo. On the left, you see the park plan from Oslo from 1953. These are kind of pretty fundamental documents that are related to the combination of the city of Oslo with its hinterland. So you see the gray dot in the middle on the map on the right is the Oslo city, and the other parts are the kind of rural hinterlands that were sort of joined into the city in 1950. You see some things on these two plans that are quite important for understanding what people imagined the qualities of a regional city was in the 1950s, what elements they installed that still kind of describe the city today. So the park map on the left, you see the green structure of Oslo. You see that there are corridors extending from the big forests and down to the fjord. You can basically move in these kind of green spaces all the way from the hills and down to the waterside. So those are the green spaces. And you can see the black lines are then path systems. That means you can walk along these pedestrian paths all the way from the surroundings down to the city center. This is a structure that still kind of dominates urban planning in Oslo today. Another thing is that the forest was protected at that time. So what you see as green in 1953 is still green today. It's basically protected by law. On the image of the right, you see another system. These yellow dots on the map are urban development areas. So see in 1950, they really imagined that the city would grow a lot very fast. And you also see the subway lines. So the subway lines were established in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, extending far out into the suburbs, passing through these yellow dots. Each yellow dot is a subcenter. So a small subway stop with social services, schools, shops, etc., and then housing surrounded in walking distance. So at that time, people didn't have cars. Cars didn't become available for private purchase for another 10 years in Norway, so everybody were depending on the subway to go to work. So these new yellow dots were about 10 to 20,000 people in each dot, so surrounding one subway station. That's a principle that Oslo has been planned after ever since. So now we jump to today. You see the image on the right is from the 2015 municipal plan. You can see a lot has happened over 50 years. And you still see the subcenters. They are marked in circles. They are the subway stops with little local centers. There are also some of the subway stops that are open for future expansion. They are the top left image where you see subway stops that still doesn't have major urban development around it and can be developed further. And on the bottom left, you see the development areas that the city are looking at for further housing development. They are, to a large extent, former industrial areas that are now sort of being available for urban development and housing. If we jump scale, we jump to the regional plan for Oslo and the surrounding region. You see Oslo is the kind of center red circle there. And you see that the regional plan specifies that all future or the vast majority of future development in the region should happen in Oslo or in one of the other cities around Oslo that has a railway station. So the kind of smaller red dots are the surrounding smaller cities with railway stations, and 90% of all growth in the region has been channeled into these railway station adjacent areas for the last 10 years, and the plan is now being revised. So it's been a very successful plan, but with some of the consequences that you see on the right. So this is one of the kind of small, up to about 10 years ago, 2 to 3 story station town outside Oslo, where suddenly developers understood that they could build really tall buildings because they were right next to the railway station. Another urban policy that's been in place for a decade or more is the policy for opening rivers and streams. So in 1990, 67% of all the rivers and streams in Oslo were covered up. They were used as sewers and they were put in pipes and buried underneath the ground so you could build houses and whatever on top. But this policy was installed in the 2010s with the municipal plan in 2015. And the policy was to open up as many of these rivers and streams as possible in order to renaturalize the urban waterways. So the reason you want to renaturalize the waterways is because you want to increase biodiversity and the quality of water. The Oslo fjord has very poor water quality, so all the kind of contributing rivers have to be cleaned up in order to clean up the Oslo fjord. You want to be able to handle sort of increased amounts of precipitation, which will happen due to climate change in the coming years. You want to create drainage buffers that kind of slows the runoff of water, so you can handle and avoid floods downstream. You want to use this opportunity to uncover where pollution happens. And it turns out that there were a lot of kind of unmapped and undocumented pollution sources, private and public. And of course, also the question of aesthetics or pedagogy. So teaching the inhabitants of the city about the kind of natural landscape that the city is built on, sort of installing a sense of care amongst the inhabitants. And one of the consequences is, of course, that these spaces become hugely popular. So the houses you see in the image here has suddenly kind of jumped in prices compared to the situation before the river opened. So the next policy that Oslo has been pursuing for the next couple of years, for the last decade or two, has been the bicycle strategy. So the bicycle strategy was decided in 2013, and the goal was to bring up the use of bicycles for everyday commute from 8% up to 16%. There were kind of strategies for working with how to sort of increase the feeling of safety, how to bring more women and more children to start biking. And there was a kind of entirely new urban cycling path standard that was established in 2017. And you see some images of the right of these kind of plans and how they are organized in order to facilitate biking sort of. And it's about legibility and visibility, making it easy to see where to cycle and where the cyclists are. It's about safety and accessibility with these red bicycle boxes, so the bikes sort of are allowed to enter into the cross sections before the bikes. It's about safety, so it's protecting bike lanes and also about increasing the capacity and the experience of biking, so more people can cycle safely on these bike lanes. The point of the whole thing was to make cycling part of everyday life for people, and I think that has happened to a large extent. There were just some numbers released recently that 90% of all people in Oslo can reach this network of protected bike lanes within 200 meters from where they live, but also some numbers that show that even though that had been an increase in bicycle use, we were still far from the 16% that the strategy set out in 2013. So the measures put in place were quite different. On the top left, the small image, you just see one place where a small sort of bicycle connection from one street to the other suddenly facilitates bike riding and little sort of red signals for bikes and green signals for bikes. On the right, you see much more extensive and expensive bike networks. So this is a bike bridge that has been installed along one of the kind of higher tier, the kind of first class cycling routes. In 2008, the city approved a plan to transform the harborfront. So Oslo has about 10 kilometers of harborfront. You see the plan on the top left. This was industrial harbor with all kinds of mixed goods, with ferries, etc., sort of bulk container, etc. And the whole area that the city decided to transform was 228 hectares, so quite a big transformation. The reason this happened was that this city wanted to make the harbor and the water more approachable to people. They wanted to use the opportunity for cleaning up the water in the inner harbor. But of course, this required a lot of quite heavy investment. So for starter, because Oslo is in the bottom of a fjord, you had the motorway that ran through the city center along the harbor, separating the harbor from the city. The government paid to put that into a tunnel, which suddenly made it possible to walk from the city to the harbor, which hadn't been the case before. So the city just decided to build a continuous public space along the harbor. It's a 9-kilometer long harborfront promenade, and make connections from the city and down to the water. So there's this promenade, but there are also squares and kind of transversal connections that connects to the city areas behind. Some of these city areas were close to the harbor originally and were not particularly wealthy parts of the city. And some of them have sort of enjoyed being connected to the city in a new way. The harbor is still there, and an agreement was made between the city and the harbor. The harbor is a publicly owned private company that a new industrial harbor, container harbor, and other kind of facilities would be built in the area you see on the left, the circle, financed by housing development in all the rest of the harbor areas. So there's a kind of big sort of financial transfer from housing being developed, quite dense housing, and office areas being developed along the harbor, and the development of this new, highly industrial, but much more compact harbor that remains. So the situation is now that there has been an investment in cultural institutions. The very first investment was from the government to locate a new opera house that you see on the image of the right on the harbor in what used to be the industrial harbor. And this cannot kickstart the whole harborfront development. There's also 2 new museums along the harborfront, or 3 actually in total, and about 9,000 new dwellings and 50,000 new jobs. So quite sort of a substantial transformation of a pretty important part of the city. And if you go there in summer, it's packed of people. And even in winter, you see people jumping in the water from these little floating saunas that you just see a glimpse of on the left. So we'll jump in a bit more specifically in some of the projects that are kind of part of this sustainability transformation of Oslo. I'll start by just explaining the next big urban transformation. So the harbor city, the fjord city, is not fully developed, but is close to being fully developed. And the city has now turned its attention to the old industrial zone to the northeast of the city center called Hovedbyen. And on the left, you see an example of an industrial area. You see a small image on the left. This used to be car dealerships, small-scale industrial production, etc. That's being transformed into a city district. So the whole Hovedbyen area is a future transformation potential of between 30 and 40,000 new dwellings and between 50 and 100,000 new workplaces. It consists of many different areas, and the Insjöbyen is just one part of it. And the development horizon is something between 30 to 50 years. So even though Oslo is growing, it's not growing that fast. So the plan for this whole district was decided 20 years ago in 2022. And here we see Insjöbyen, which is the kind of parts of it closest to the city center, where there was an old existing subway station. And there was a commercial street sort of built in connection to it, and housing and public institutions popping up nearby it. So this area has 7,000 new apartments and is supposed to be kind of fully developed in about 5 years from now. So one of the aspects of this policy, this project refers back to what I talked about before, about the nodal point developments in Oslo. So Oslo has an extensive subway system, Along some of the stations, there are these local centers and about 15 to 20,000 dwellings, people living near each subway station in walking distance. Some of the subway stations, however, did not have a lot of housing surrounding them. And this was one of them, the Insjø subway station. So this became one of the kind of nodal points along the subway lines that enables the city to develop without having to build new infrastructure. So the next project I just want to mention is a project called Car-Free Livability. This is a program that was initiated in 2015 or 16, and the basis of the project was that looking at the climate gas emissions from Oslo, about 60% of the emissions are from car use or were from car use. Yeah, 60% of the city CO2 emissions were from vehicles and 40% from private cars, so 2/3 of that. There is a great incentive to try to reduce the use of private cars, particularly in the city center. And this, of course, also relates to the possibility of improving the quality of life for people living there and making the city center more attractive for the citizens of the whole city. So the way this project was installed was very gradual. Show the map on the top left, on the bottom left, you see that the project started in the downtown area on the left and then expanded to areas that you see the kind of blob to the right. So from just being 1.5 square kilometers in the absolute city center, it's gradually expanded to cover more and more of the city. So what the project does is that it has closed off streets. It has reused parking spaces for alternative uses. And the way it's done is through a gradual experimental approach. So the city has basically year from year tried out what happens if we close this street, what happens if we make a little park here, what happens if we plant a few trees here, what will happen. And as you see, the installations on the images on the top right are temporary. It can be removed. Some have been removed and some have been kind of converted into permanent fixtures of how the city has improved its central urban spaces. Of course, this caused a lot of controversy. People were very unhappy about losing parking spaces. So part of the project was also to actually improve urban logistics. So it's about reclaiming some of the parking spaces for goods deliveries, and it's about increasing the number of disabled parking spaces in the city. So these were some of the measures that were put in place to kind of counter some of the critique from car owners and from some of the shop owners in the city center who were fearful about losing customers. But after a 10-year period, it turns out that overall, there has not been a loss of customers and an almost threefold increase in the number of people in these city center streets. So the last project I want to mention that has been important in Oslo's transformation, sustainability transformation, is a project called Future Build. This is a project that Oslo is part of in collaboration with the other bigger cities in Norway, Bergen, Trondheim, and Stavanger, and with some of the suburban municipalities in the Oslo region. So the purpose of the project was to produce demonstrator projects for climate neutral architecture and urban development projects based on high quality architecture. So the purpose was, the audience were primarily developers, and the purpose was to convince developers that it is possible to build climate neutral architecture and housing and urban development projects. So it started in 2010 with these 8 municipalities. There are now 75 pilot projects that have been completed, and they have shown that they could cut carbon emissions in construction by at least 50% compared to current regulations and building practices. So that's been quite well established. So what this project does, it has, as you see on the kind of graph on the left, a purpose of at least in short term, a 50% reduction in climate gas emission from a new construction, and eventually a much more kind of radical increase. So this project offers counseling and quality assurance for developers and architects and builders. In the city of Oslo, if you are part of this project, you get accelerated building permit approval. So you're basically put first in line for building permit approval if you kind of fill the requirement and have it been accepted into the project. You also get reduced processing fees. So you simply get a discount on how much it costs to process the fee. You also get assistance on how to get government funding for energy savings, for instance. And on the website, you see one of the example projects. This is Fyrstikbakken in Oslo. This is a project with 4 apartment blocks built in cross-laminated timber, so full timber construction. So built for car-free living with only 36 parking spaces for these 4 blocks, quite close to a subway station. So the project also went into social sustainability issues by discussing how do we live together. There was experiments here with over 260 square meters of indoor shared space, so shared rooms, shared workshops, etc., to foster good neighborhood relations. And as you see, the number on the bottom here is that it has achieved a reduction of 53% of greenhouse gas emissions and is near zero energy use for heating and electricity when operating. So this is an example of one of the 75 projects in this overall the Future Build project, and everything's well documented on this website that you are welcome to visit. So I will say a little bit about a thing that is particular in the Nordic countries, and I will use Oslo an example of what it means to be a winter city. So every city is unique in its own way, and one of the things that makes Oslo and many other cities in the Nordic countries special is, of course, that the winter is long and it's dark. And in Oslo, we quite regularly have about 3 months of snow every winter. The season has shortened in recent years, but still winter is an issue. So winter is an issue in different ways. Starting from the left, you can simply get seriously damaged by falling snow. This is one of the kind of conditions that urban planners and urban managers have to consider on an everyday basis, that snow is actually kind of a danger to people. In winter, snow and ice can be an impediment for big parts of the population, as you see on the image in the middle. Some people are simply not able to move about the city if snow clearance is not something that happens very systematically. And then on the right, you see some of the traffic situations. These are images from last year, where you see one of the new electric buses in Oslo kind of zigzagging up and blocking a road. So general mobility in the city is quite frequently impacted by winter. So winter can be a joy and a pleasure, and it usually is, but it's also something that really represents challenges for some citizens and for the city as a whole. But of course, that is also something that can be managed. So the city spends a lot of time and energy on snow management. The two images on the left are not from Oslo, but it doesn't really matter, but they're just examples of how they are from Norway, but they're examples of how urban planning can be conducted in ways that considers winter as a condition. This sounds very banal, but what you see on the left is the possibility of moving in with a big tractor to move snow and then push it into a corner somewhere where it can sit for the rest of the winter. So simply setting off these square meters in a new urban development is part of what makes snow management possible. On the bottom right, you see a high-tech solution to winter management. This is Terje. This is a floating barge that the city of Oslo uses in winter to get rid of snow. So a challenge is where do you deposit snow once you've cleared it? You can deposit it on the left, but if you collect it in big piles, you have to consider that it may be full of contaminants, it might be full of road dust, it might be full of heavy metals, etc. And it might even be full of old bicycles that you manage to kind of pick up with your big shovels when you remove it. So Oslo has this big melting rig on the right that also serves as a cleaning device that cleans the water before it runs into the Oslo fjord. So this is one of the measures put in place to clean up the fjord. There are different ways you can talk about what winter matters in terms of urban design or planning. Norman Pressman, the Canadian urban planner, has often talked about the need for a winter grammar of urban design. He talks about how you can make sure that you make a tolerable microclimate in the city, makes urban spaces that are sheltered from wind, excessive snow, etc. It's about winter adapting infrastructure and making sure that it's accessible for all people in the city. And then finally, it's about possibilities for educating people about what the city is and what they can use it for, and for celebrating it when it happens in a positive way. So people don't think necessarily of the city just as a negative thing, but also as an asset to their urban life. The last point is something that Oslo has plenty of examples of in its urban planning. You see the map on the left is the green space map from Oslo, and you see one of the green corridors on the right that's used as a toboggan, sledge, and ski slope by the children of this urban district in Oslo every winter. So this is what happens inside the city in terms of winter joy. But of course, the city is also surrounded by forests. That means you can go to the downhill ski center by subway, which is the image you see on the left, and you can go cross-country skiing, which is what you see on the image on the right. So all this is well and good. Oslo has come a long way with its urban sustainability transformation and policies. There are lots of actors building new urban development projects where they look at issues of climate impact, sustainability impacts, water quality, etc. But we all know that the urban transformation of society is not without social consequences and implications. And I just want to bring up a few of the kind of social sustainability challenges that Oslo encounters. So I'll talk a bit about gentrification. I'll say something about social segregation and about greenwashing. So I talked about the fjord city transformation of the former industrial harbor before. So a very successful project that has transformed the harborfront, houses about 10,000 new dwellings, and has made the harborfront accessible as a public space and the water and the fjord as a recreational space for the city's citizens of Oslo. However, there is no provision in the fjord city for building affordable housing. The slightly complicated graph on the top right shows a selection of fjord city development areas. On the right, the vertical line is the average income of Oslo, and you see in all these areas people with much higher income than the average in Oslo live. The picture shows an urban district called Rijeka, where you see that the average income of residents there is about 1.6%. 1.6 times the average income of Oslo. This is compared to other new development areas in Oslo, like the areas below, some of them we looked at before, where you see the income of average income is actually lower than the Oslo areas. So because there is no provision for low-cost housing, and because the housing market in Oslo and in Norway in general is almost completely privatized. The ownership percentage among families is about 90% in Norway, so everybody owns the house. And that makes it into on one hand, very successful project, but also a project that actually accelerates in some ways the social divisions in the city. And Oslo is a socially segregated city. You see on the image on the right, the bottom right, a map of Oslo, where you see the high-income neighborhoods in Oslo versus the low-income neighborhoods in Oslo. We'll call that Oslo East and Oslo West, where Oslo West is the affluent parts of the city and Oslo East are the kind of socially vulnerable sections of the city. And you see there are quite significant differences between East and West when it comes to, for instance, primary school as the highest level of education. In Oslo East, that's 30% of the population. Oslo West is 30%. In Oslo East, the proportion of children in low-income families is more than 6 times higher than in Oslo West. The proportion of adults who are not employed is twice as high in Oslo East compared to Oslo West. Life expectancy is 4 years shorter in Oslo East compared to West. And more than twice as many people in Oslo West experience their local environment as safe compared to Oslo East. So quite significant changes between these two pretty kind of similar sized parts of the city. I'll say a little bit about greenwashing in the end. It's a topic that I'm sure many of you are aware of. Very often we hear about greenwashing in terms of commercial products. And greenwashing is defined as something like false or misleading claims and symbolisms to give the impression of a commitment to environmental protection of sustainability. So you can perhaps think of examples of companies that sort of claim to be environmental on the package, but if you start investigating, things are a lot more complicated. I'll start with a map on the far left, which kind of underlines a kind of basic sustainability challenge in Norwegian society, and that is that Norway is a major oil and gas producer. An increasingly significant proportion of European liquid gas is produced in Norway. So you could say that the Norwegian continental shelf makes Norway a huge contributor to global warming. The second point I just want to bring out that even though Norway and Oslo has had great success in transforming its car fleet from being carbon-based towards electric, and the latest number, as I've heard, is that now 80% of cars sold in Norway are now electric. This also has some kind of hidden backsides. If you compare, for instance, Volkswagen Passat diesel compared to a Tesla Model 3, you'll see that Tesla had about 50% more climate emissions in its production, and that's largely because of the batteries. Of course, in use, if you have the right energy mix, that's kind of made up within a few years. But the number of big cars in Oslo has increased, or in Norway has increased tremendously. So the number of SUVs have increased to about 63% of all cars sold in Norway. And cars have become a lot heavier, so there's a lot more wear on roads, a lot more kind of emissions from tires, etc. So from 2000 to 2022, the average car became 800 kilos heavier. And also research has showed that people who drive electric cars or purchase electric cars, because that gives them certain advantages, they can drive in the bus lanes, they can get reduced the road tolls, etc. They also tend to kind of keep their old vehicles, their old carbon emission vehicles. So they will also kind of have two cars. And in total, there's actually not necessarily a reduction, but rather an increase in the number of kilometers driven. So this is a complex picture, but just kind of to illustrate that even though something that's heralded as a big kind of environmental success is complicated, that might not necessarily be exactly what you see on the label. The third image you've seen twice before, and I bring it here because I think this also illustrates another aspect of greenwashing or potential greenwashing in urban planning. So this is the urban development near a train station in the Oslo region. As you see, it's a very compact and very tall development. And this small girl in a red jacket below kind of looks up and wonders what's going up there and tries to see the sky. And of course, the social sustainability of these quarters is not really something that's been the basis for the planning permission to build this tall and this compact in this urban dense. So even though planning policy for these nodal developments is compact in order to facilitate public transport, the social sustainability issues have not really necessarily been developed to the same extent. So this was what I had to tell you about planning and urban sustainability policies in Oslo. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations. So thank you.